The courtroom was silent as 7-year-old Aaliyah Daniels swung her legs under the heavy wooden bench, her feet barely brushing the floor. The judge peered down at her over his glasses, his voice stern. "Do you understand why you're here today?" he asked. Aaliyah nodded, her small hands twisting in her lap. Then, after a pause, she looked up, her wide brown eyes filled with hesitation. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "But I'm really hungry." The room froze, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a sudden chill. What the judge did next left everyone stunned. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more intriguing stories. It was an unusually quiet day in the courtroom when 7-year-old Aaliyah Daniels stood before the judge. Her small, slender frame seemed almost swallowed by the oversized wooden bench where she sat, her legs dangling above the polished floor. Dressed in a simple yellow sundress, she didn't look like someone who belonged in a courthouse, let alone in front of a judge. Yet there she was, her eyes wide and cautious, darting between the stern-faced adults who loomed over her. Aaliyah's mother sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly together as tears streamed silently down her face. She had been there for hours, watching the proceedings with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The court-appointed lawyer beside her wore a tired expression, shuffling papers on the table as though he had already resigned himself to the outcome. The judge, a gray-haired man with deep lines etched into his face, adjusted his glasses as he looked down at Aaliyah. He had seen many cases in his time on the bench, some heartbreaking, others infuriating, but this one sat heavily on his chest. The charges against Aaliyah were troubling, though her age made the situation all the more surreal. The courtroom murmured quietly, whispers rising like smoke as people leaned toward one another, speculating on what would happen next. As the judge began to speak, his voice stern but measured, Aaliyah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Miss Daniels," he said, peering at her over his glasses, "do you understand why you're here today?" Aaliyah fidgeted, her fingers twisting in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was small but clear. "Yes, sir," she said softly. The judge nodded and continued, his tone softening slightly. "And do you understand the charges against you?" Aaliyah looked down at her lap, her feet swinging nervously. She nodded but didn't speak. The judge sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Before we proceed, is there anything you'd like to say, young lady?" There was a pause. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to answer. Finally, Aaliyah looked up at him, her dark brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and innocence. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then said, "I'm hungry." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. The judge blinked, caught off guard. The attorneys exchanged bewildered glances, and even the court stenographer paused, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "You're hungry?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, sir. I haven't eaten since yesterday. My tummy hurts." Her words cut through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom like a knife. Gasps echoed around the room, and Aaliyah's mother let out a soft, pained sob. The judge sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed deeply. He adjusted his glasses again, as though trying to buy himself time to process what he had just heard. "What did you eat yesterday?" he asked carefully. Aaliyah shrugged, her voice barely audible. "Just some crackers. We didn't have much." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, and he looked toward the bailiff. "Please bring this child something to eat immediately," he said, his voice carrying an unusual urgency. The bailiff, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, hesitated for only a moment before nodding and stepping out of the room. Aaliyah looked up at the judge, her expression unsure, as though she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. The judge turned his gaze back to the courtroom, his voice firm. "This proceeding is temporarily adjourned," he announced. "We will reconvene after Miss Daniels has had a proper meal." The room erupted into murmurs, disbelief and confusion rippling through the crowd. The judge's decision was unusual, unorthodox even, but there was something in his tone that brooked no argument. Within minutes, the bailiff returned with a small tray, a sandwich, a carton of milk, and an apple balanced precariously on top. He set it down on the table in front of Aaliyah, who stared at it with wide eyes. "Go ahead," the judge said gently. "Eek." Aaliyah hesitated, glancing at her mother for reassurance. When her mother nodded, she picked up the sandwich and began to eat, her small hands gripping it tightly. She chewed slowly at first, but as hunger took over, her bites grew faster and more determined. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the little girl who had been too hungry to focus on the weight of what was happening around her. The judge watched her with a somber expression, his hand resting against his chin. He didn't speak, but something in his eyes had shifted. When Aaliyah finished the meal, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. The judge nodded, his voice steady but low. "You're welcome." What happened next would shock the room even more than the adjournment. After a brief recess, the judge returned to his bench, his face set with quiet determination. Instead of continuing the hearing, he began asking questions that had little to do with the charges against Aaliyah and everything to do with her life at home. "Aaliyah," he said carefully, "does your family often go without food?" Aaliyah's small shoulders tensed, and she glanced at her mother, unsure of how to answer. "It's okay," the judge reassured her. "You can tell me the truth." Aaliyah hesitated before nodding. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Mama says we'll be okay, but sometimes we don't have enough." The judge looked at her mother, who was wiping her tears away with a tissue. His expression softened, but there was steel in his voice when he addressed her. "Mrs. Daniels," he said, "why has this child been allowed to go hungry?" Her mother's voice cracked as she replied, "Your Honor, I try. I really do. I work 2 jobs, but it's not enough. I've been trying to get help, but the system, it's so slow. I didn't want her to suffer." The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he turned to the court clerk and began issuing orders that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. By the time the hearing resumed, it wasn't just Aaliyah's case that was under review. It was her entire life. The judge's actions, driven by compassion and a determination to uncover the truth, would spark a community-wide effort to provide for Aaliyah and her mother, uncovering injustices and systemic failures that had led to their plight. And as Aaliyah sat in the courtroom, her tummy no longer aching with hunger, she couldn't have known that her simple plea, "I'm hungry," would change everything. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the judge resumed the hearing, his face heavy with thought. He leaned forward, addressing the room with a voice that carried both authority and an unmistakable undercurrent of resolve. "This court cannot and will not proceed without fully understanding the circumstances surrounding this case," he said. "It is clear that this child's situation extends far beyond the charges brought against her. Miss Daniels is not only a defendant, but a victim of systemic neglect and inequity that this court can no longer ignore." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. No one expected a judge to speak so bluntly, especially in a case involving such serious charges. But as Aaliyah sat there, her small hands still clutching the now empty carton of milk, it was clear the judge's words had begun to shift the room's focus. The prosecutor, a tall, stern woman who had seemed unwavering in her case moments ago, stood abruptly. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharp, "I must remind the court that while this child's circumstances are indeed unfortunate, we are here to address a legal matter. The charges against Miss Daniels involve—" "I am well aware of the charges," the judge interrupted, his tone unyielding. "And I am also aware that this courtroom exists to deliver justice, not perpetuate cycles of punishment that solve nothing." He turned his gaze to the prosecutor. "Would you agree, counselor?" The prosecutor faltered. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, her voice quieter now. "But—" "No buts," the judge said firmly. "I will hear arguments related to the charges, but I am also ordering an immediate review of this child's home environment, access to basic needs, and any interventions, or lack thereof, by the relevant authorities." This will not be treated as a case in isolation. It is part of a larger story, and I intend to see it fully examined. The courtroom murmurs grew louder. Reporters seated in the back scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their eyes darting between the judge, the prosecutor, and Aaliyah, who sat quietly, her feet still not reaching the floor. Aaliyah's mother, Denise, stood up suddenly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't mean to interrupt, but please, don't punish her for something she didn't mean to do. She's just a little girl. She doesn't understand everything." The judge held up a hand to calm her. "Mrs. Daniels," he said, "this is not about assigning blame. It's about understanding the full context of why your daughter is here today." Denise sank back into her seat, her hands clutching her purse as tears streamed down her cheeks. Aaliyah turned toward her mother, her small face etched with worry. "Is Mama in trouble?" Aaliyah whispered, her voice barely audible. The judge heard her. His expression softened. "No, Aaliyah," he said gently. "Your mother is not in trouble. I'm trying to help both of you. Do you understand?" Aaliyah hesitated, then nodded. The judge straightened in his chair, his tone becoming more formal. "I am ordering a temporary recess while we gather further information about Miss Daniels' circumstances. Additionally, I am requesting a representative from the Department of Child Services to appear in this courtroom tomorrow morning to explain why this family has fallen through the cracks." Denise gasped softly, and the prosecutor looked visibly uncomfortable. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. "Justice must address the root causes of harm, not simply its symptoms. This hearing will resume when I am satisfied that we have a clearer picture of what has happened to this child and her family." The gavel came down with a decisive crack. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Denise and Aaliyah as they stepped into the chilly afternoon air. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust forward as a barrage of questions filled the air. "Mrs. Daniels, how do you feel about the judge's decisions? Do you think the charges against your daughter are justified? What do you want people to know about your situation?" Denise tightened her grip on Aaliyah's hand, shielding her daughter from the crush of reporters. Her voice was quiet but firm as she said, "My little girl is a good child. She didn't mean any harm. That's all I have to say." The reporters pressed closer, but a court officer intervened, helping Denise and Aaliyah navigate through the crowd. As they climbed into a waiting car, Denise let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she brushed Aaliyah's hair from her face. "It's okay, baby," she said, though her voice wavered. "We'll get through this." Aaliyah leaned into her mother's side, her small frame warm against Denise's. "I believe you, Mama," she said softly. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word of the judge's unexpected actions had spread, and spectators filled every available seat. Among them was a woman from Child Services, a man representing a local food bank, and even a representative from a nearby nonprofit that worked with at-risk families. The judge entered the courtroom, his expression as stern as ever. As he called the proceedings to order, he addressed the room with deliberate intensity. "This is no longer just a hearing about a single child's actions," he said. "This is about a system that has failed her." Over the course of the day, testimonies painted a grim picture. Denise had been struggling for years, juggling multiple jobs while trying to care for her daughter. Their landlord had raised the rent beyond what she could afford, forcing them to move into a cramped apartment with unreliable heating. Food assistance had been delayed for months due to bureaucratic red tape, leaving Denise to stretch every dollar while keeping Aaliyah fed. By the end of the hearing, the mood in the courtroom was somber. The judge sat quietly for a long time before speaking. "I have heard enough," he said finally. His gaze swept the room. "Miss Daniels is a child who's been let down by the very systems designed to protect her. She does not need punishment. She needs support." Turning to Denise, he added, "And so do you?" The judge outlined a plan. He ordered immediate intervention by Child Services to provide food assistance and housing support. He connected the family with the local nonprofit and the food bank representatives. And he dismissed the charges against Aaliyah, citing her age and the extenuating circumstances. When the gavel came down for the final time, The courtroom erupted into applause. Denise broke into tears, hugging Aaliyah tightly as relief washed over her. The little girl looked up at her mother with wide eyes, her lips curving into a small, hopeful smile. "Does this mean we're going to be okay?" Aaliyah asked. Denise nodded, her voice steady for the first time in months. "Yes, baby, we're going to be okay." As they walked out of the courthouse, the weight that had burdened them for so long began to lift. It wasn't a perfect solution, and challenges still lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. The story of Aaliyah Daniels became a rallying cry in the community. People came forward with donations, offers of help, and demands for change. Local leaders began examining the gaps in the system, inspired by a little girl's simple, honest plea. "I'm hungry." And through it all, Aaliyah and her mother held onto each other, determined to build a better future, one small step at a time. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Denise and Aaliyah. News outlets picked up their story, and while Denise shied away from a spotlight, she couldn't ignore the wave of support that came pouring in. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged them before now knocked on their door with groceries or clothing. Local charities organized fundraisers to help cover their rent and utilities. But as much as the outpouring of kindness warmed Denise's heart, it was also overwhelming. She wasn't used to accepting help, and the sudden attention left her feeling exposed. She had spent so much of her life fighting to keep her struggles private, shielding Aaliyah from the worst of it, that it was hard to let her guard down. One night, as she tucked Aaliyah into bed, Denise sat beside her daughter, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "You've been so brave," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope you know how proud I am of you." Aaliyah blinked up at her, her wide brown eyes thoughtful. "Are you proud because I said I was hungry?" Denise hesitated, her chest tightening. She leaned down to kiss Aaliyah's forehead. "I'm proud because you're strong," she said, "and because you remind me to never stop fighting." The following week, the nonprofit group that had attended their hearing reached out to Denise with an offer. They wanted her to speak at an upcoming community forum about food insecurity and systemic failures. At first, Denise balked at the idea. She didn't feel comfortable standing in front of a crowd, sharing the most vulnerable parts of her life. "I'm not a speaker," she told the woman on the phone. "I'm just a mom trying to take care of my kid." "That's exactly why your voice matters," the woman replied. "People need to hear your story from you. It's the only way to make sure this doesn't keep happening to other families." Denise thought about it for a long time. Finally, she agreed. The forum was held at a local community center, with rows of folding chairs filling the space. The air buzzed with quiet conversation as attendees, many of them parents and advocates, waited for the event to begin. Denise sat backstage, her hands clasped tightly together. Aaliyah was with her, sitting cross-legged on a chair with her favorite stuffed bear in her lap. "You okay, Mama?" Aaliyah asked, looking up at her with concern. Denise forced a smile. "Just a little nervous," she admitted. "Do you want me to come with you?" Aaliyah offered, her voice small but earnest. Denise's heart melted. "No, baby. This is something I need to do by myself. But just knowing you're here helps." When it was her turn to speak, Denise stepped onto the small stage, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching her expectantly, and felt a moment of panic. But then she spotted Aaliyah, sitting in the front row with her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest, and the fear eased. She took a deep breath. "My name is Denise Daniels," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves. "And for most of my life, I've done everything I could to keep my struggles hidden. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I thought it was the only way to survive. But then my little girl, Aaliyah, reminded me of something important. She reminded me that asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The room fell silent as Denise recounted their story. She spoke about the nights she had gone without food so Aaliyah could eat, about the countless hours she worked to make ends meet, and about the humiliation of navigating a system that seemed designed to fail those who needed it most. She talked about the court hearing, about Aaliyah's simple plea, "I'm hungry," and how it had sparked a conversation that was long overdue. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The crowd erupted into applause, and Denise felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her. She had shared her story not because she wanted pity, but because she wanted change. And in that moment, she believed change was possible. In the months that followed, things began to improve. Denise and Aaliyah moved into a new apartment with the help of a nonprofit group, one with reliable heating and enough space for both of them to breathe. Denise found a new job with better hours and pay, allowing her to spend more time with Aaliyah. The local community, inspired by their story, rallied to address the systemic gaps that had left families like theirs struggling in silence. A new food pantry opened in the neighborhood, and a coalition of advocates worked to streamline access to assistance programs, making it easier for families to get the help they needed. Aaliyah, now thriving in school, became a symbol of resilience and hope. Her teachers often commented on her kindness and determination, and her classmates gravitated toward her sunny, optimistic personality. One afternoon, as Denise picked Aaliyah up from school, her daughter ran toward her with a drawing clutched in her hand. "Look, Mama," Aaliyah exclaimed, holding it up. The drawing was simple but heartfelt. A picture of Aaliyah and Denise standing side by side, smiling under a bright sun. Above them, in large, uneven letters, were the words, "We're okay now." Denise felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged Aaliyah tightly. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "We're okay now." Their journey wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, Denise and Aaliyah had hope. A future filled with possibilities instead of fear. And it all began with a little girl's brave, honest words that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. "I'm hungry." Hope you enjoyed. Comment below your thoughts and opinions. Please like and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next one.